I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Gerald. I'm one of the moderators of this event. I'm a professor at SUNY New Paltz. I'm joined by Deb Clinton, who survived the political science class that I taught long ago. She's a school administrator, works as a principal of the middle school in Southern Ulster County. She's the founder of Move Forward New York, this sponsoring organization for this event. Let me summarize how we're going to proceed so everybody understands what we're doing here, and we can proceed in an orderly and productive fashion. I have two pairs of glasses, so I have to keep taking them off and putting them on. I'm going to set out some general expectations for the meeting. Ms. Clinton will specify the process that we're going to use to conduct the meeting and question the Congressman. We'll recognize Geher, another co-founder of Move Forward New York, to briefly describe the organization. Congressman Faso will speak for about 10 minutes. We will then have questions for 1 hour. And just to note, we haven't allowed signs this evening, both because of the security advice and because, as a matter of courtesy, it blocks the view of some people in the room. So that's why you don't see any signs. Now let me say that this is an exercise in democracy and accountability. It was a much desired and anticipated meeting by a lot of people here today. And we're certainly going to get into matters of great controversy about nationally held views in a very challenging time for the United States. There's a great range of views here, I know, and a great diversity of people. My expectation is that we will conduct this meeting with order and civility, and Debra and I are going to insist on that. We expect as well that we will listen to each other and the Congressman. So we would expect to maximize the amount of time they'll be listening and communicating throughout the event. Now Debra will provide guidelines on how we're going to proceed with the question.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. With regards to the questions, you had an opportunity when you came in to put a question on a card. Those questions have been sorted here by topic area that Dr. Benjamin and I will be selecting questions as we go. Please note that we will take turns selecting questions. I will actually be asking the first question and then Dr. Benjamin the second, and so on. We will call the questioner up. You will receive your card back so you can read your question directly from your card. And in the meantime, we'll bring the next questioner up to wait to be ready to go next so we can move through this in a timely fashion. As the closing time approaches, we will indicate that we have 1 or 2 questions left, and we'll wrap up at that point. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones or any other devices that might make noise that you have on you right now. And at this time, I'm going to ask that Geher comes up and talks a little bit about the group Move Forward.
Thank you, Debra. All right, thanks everyone for coming out. So I'm Geher of Move Forward New York, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today at this event featuring our Congressman Gerald Faso. Let me start by saying that this event would not have been possible without the efforts of many who have put a great deal of time and effort into the planning and organizing. Several folks from our group have spent countless hours on the details, and I want to particularly thank our primary leader, Debra Clinton, for exemplary work on this event. I also also give a special shout out to Jerry Benjamin for taking an active and conscientious role as the co-moderator. So thank you, Dr. Benjamin. And I would also like to thank Congressman Faso himself for his willingness to consider a proposal for a collaboratively implemented town hall prepared by rogues like us. So thank you, Congressman Faso. And finally, I would like to thank the Congressman's District Director, Ryan McAllister, who's been a star to work with on this event. And while we may or may not vote the same way, I have to say I like working with this guy. So thank you, Ryan. Move Forward New York is a grassroots citizens action group with the primary goal of helping to, in our minds, get this nation back on track during a uniquely difficult time in our nation's history. From the outset, our goals have included activism, education, and collaboration. We believe that the United States remains the greatest democracy in the history of the earth, and we believe that active participation in government by all citizens is absolutely critical for our shared future.
Yeah.
A foundational feature of this nation has always been diversity. Diversity of all kinds drives our nation forward. And intellectual or viewpoint diversity counts. We expect everyone to hold the same ideas as ourselves to our own peril. With this in mind, we are extremely pleased that Congressman Faso has agreed to join Move Forward New York in today's town hall, which we expect to be a great exercise in ideological diversity and in democracy itself. As long as we hold events like this one, with citizens interacting directly with our elected officials in public spaces, the torch of the United States of America continues to burn brightly. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Just a little background. I've known John Faso for more than 30 years. I was in a local elective office in the region when he was not our assemblyman, but an assemblyman in Albany. We interacted a lot, and he served the region with a good deal of distinction. He's a person with great experience in public office, twice nominated for the highest offices in New York State, and now, of course, our congressman. I've always honored him. He's a SUNY graduate, which is one of the reasons he's so distinguished. Not New Paltz, SUNY Brockport. He's recognized by SUNY for his distinction in public service at the Rockefeller College in 1987. He's a genuine, I'm sorry for this, John, but he's a policy wonk. He's a man who studies policy and cares about policy. He's a person of integrity who lives his values. I'm very pleased to have the chance to introduce him here tonight. John Faso.
Well, Jerry and Debra, thank you so much, and thank all of you for being here tonight, and thank you to Move Forward. We met, I think about 3 months ago in our office in Kingston, and we had a very productive and lively discussion, and the meeting tonight is a direct outgrowth of that. And I hope it's the basis of other meetings around our 11-county district in the future. It is really a privilege and honor for me to be here. I'd be making a great mistake, though, if I also didn't introduce my wife, Mary Frances, who's with me here. Mary Frances. And we just celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary earlier this month, so that may be testament to either her endurance or lack of judgment. I'm not sure which. But it really is a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to serve. And since I have took office 8 months ago, it has been a lively political environment. And I really look forward to hearing your questions tonight, and I look forward to the dialogue we can have. First, and I'm not going to take my 10 minutes, but first I just wanted to say a couple of things. One, there's no doubt that we live in an extraordinarily polarized and divided, hyper-partisan time. You know, the left watches MSNBC and they listen to the people that they talk to, and the right watches Fox or whatever else is going on the right, and it seems as though never the twain shall meet. Well, that is not the way our system was set up. And so despite this hyper-polarized time, I think that all of us should recognize that we all share really the same, most of us, I think, virtually all of us share the same thoughts about our country. It's the greatest democracy, as Glenn said, but also it's a country where we all want better things for our kids and for our families, and we all want to ensure the safety and security of our country. We may have different points of view as to how we get there, and normal political discourse, it's normal to have disagreements. The question is, how can we move the country forward? And that's why maybe move forward, it's very appropriate that you are the host of our event here tonight. The other thing is that in this polarized time, you should know that there are now 120 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, and they range from Kevin McCarthy, the majority leader of the Republicans, to John Lewis, the civil rights icon from Atlanta, who both signed, along with 118 others, including me, a pledge of civility. Because we see the kind of temper of the times, and we decided that we should sign this pledge of civility, which says that we will respect everyone's different point of view, that we will not question people's motives in our debates, and that we will genuinely listen and try to figure out how can we compromise and solve problems. And that's something that I think is extraordinarily important, and frankly, it's missing at the highest levels of our government, and it's missing in a lot of places in our country today, and that's what we've got to work on. And part of this, and it was mentioned, I did join a group called the Problem Solvers, which is kind of a funny little name because, you know, it's really synonymous with what you should be doing as a member of Congress, solving problems. The Problem Solvers right now is 44 Democrats and Republicans, 22 each, and we agree that we should find a solution to some of these issues that we're facing. The first one we've been working on for the last 2.5 months, and we came out with a proposal right before the August break, is on healthcare. And we agreed that there are some Democratic and Republican ideas that we both agree with, that we could use to try to make incremental changes and reforms into what is the matter with the ACA. And so we announced this just before the August break. On September 5th, next week, we go back. We're going to be meeting with Senator Lamar Alexander and some Democratic senators and Republican senators who share the same outlook and mindset about how do we fix these problems and address them. So we can discuss some of those specific things here tonight as well. So lastly, I just want to say this is a great forum. It's the last day of August, but it's not too hot. It's cool. And so I look forward to hearing your questions and perspectives tonight, and thank you for being here.
So we're going to start out this evening with our first question on the topic of the environment. So I'd like to ask William Carbine to please come up. And the next question will be from Dorothy Jandela. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but if you would come up too.
What do I call?
You're going to come over here to the front, and Glenn will be helping you with the microphone. You'll have an opportunity to ask your question.
There you go. And for the process and protocol, I'll be holding the mic.
My name is William Carbine, and I'm from Franklin in Delaware County, where we have a farm. Congressman, New York Republicans, from Teddy Roosevelt to Nelson Rockefeller to George Pataki, have led the country protecting our environment and advancing the conservation of the land. Unfortunately, the Trump administration, among other things, has decided to attack the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a Republican creation, and the Antiquities Act, which was first used to great effect by the great conservationist and President Teddy Roosevelt. What do you plan to do about this?
William, thank you for the question. And you may, I'm not sure, but you may get the award for coming furthest here tonight from Franklin, which but I thank you for that. I don't agree with much of what the president has proposed. So the first thing that we're doing is on the budget. we have rejected the vast majority of his proposals regarding the Environmental Protection Agency. And just today, in fact, over in Dover, in Dutchess County, I went on a tour of the Appalachian Trail with a variety of environmental organizations, locally and nationally, because I am one of the prime co-sponsors of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is the primary vehicle through which we preserve land, that we promote environmental programs like trails, etc. But also, we reverse the proposed funding cuts, and this is going to be adopted in an appropriations bill next week, but the Appropriations Committee has already acted. Proposed funding cuts to things like the program that is used to help rural water systems get the consulting and technical advice that they need, because a lot of rural communities don't have the technical expertise, or it's too expensive. So we fund the technical assistance for rural communities. The other big thing, and candidly, the biggest source of pollution today into the Hudson River are the combined storm, water, and sewer overflows when we have heavy rainfall. So you see this in Troy, you see it in Albany, you see it up in Mechanicville, where the big pollution discharges into the Hudson River, into the Mohawk, which goes into the Hudson. But you also see it downriver as well. Virtually all of the cities in this district, whether it's Kingston, whether it's Newburgh, whether it's Poughkeepsie, a lot of the communities along the river have this problem with aging infrastructure. So I'm very very much out there in terms of trying to make sure that we have adequate funding for those things. The last thing I would say is that I am a member of what's called the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, which again is a group of Democrats and Republicans. And we are trying to make sure that we are addressing the climate change issue and doing it in a way that is fiscally responsible and economically viable for the communities, particularly communities upstate, the kind that we represent in our district in the 11 counties. So for instance, just recently I voted with, I think we had maybe 35 or 40 Republicans who voted against a Republican amendment to the appropriations bill on the defense appropriations, which would have mandated that the Defense Department stop assessing climate change when it looks at its effects upon our defense posture and on our readiness. So I was one of the Republicans that stood up and said, no, we should be evaluating those concerns as we go forward. So yes, I agree with you that this is an area where there's a lot of consternation. We have a lot of we're going to have a lot of fights going forward, but I think that so far you'll see in the appropriation bills that we're going to pass next week that we've restored virtually all of the cuts, not all of them, but virtually all of the cuts that the President proposed in his budget.
Thanks, Congressman.
Thank you very much.
We'll have our next person come up.
Dorothy Giandelia.
Hello. In May, the FCC voted to start a proceeding to repeal the 2015 net neutrality rules and the legal authority underlying the Title II of the Communications Act of 1934.
We can't hear.
I'm sorry. The rules ensure that internet users can access the online content and services of their choosing without interference from the ISPs like Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and Charter. Among the other changes this could allow would be that the companies can alter the speed, slow it down, of transmission and charge extra to patrons for increased speed after we've already paid for the internet. What is your position on this, and how do you see yourself voting?
So I think that the...
Karen, just one moment. Kelly McKenzie's next. Would she prepare, please, by coming up?
So two things. One, the so-called net neutrality rules that the FCC adopted during the Obama administration. I think there's a lot of argument to be made, and I am sympathetic to this argument, that the FCC went down the wrong path in terms of using the so-called Title II, which is a Ma Bell 1930s era regulatory statute in order to do the net neutrality rule. I do think that there's an effort going on in Congress right now to have many of the protections that were set forth in the net neutrality rule done legislatively rather than administratively. And I think that that would be a better approach. So I do support a legislative effort to try to address some of the concerns that you raise, although I do note that there is, to my knowledge, no evidence so far that companies have been using the efforts to slow down their consumers' access to the internet. I would also note, just parenthetically, because you reminded me, that I voted against the repeal of another FCC rule that would have allowed the ISPs to use the consumer information of individual consumers without their permission. So it was something that I voted against the repeal of a rule. It was repealed by the Congress, the House and the Senate, but I voted against it because I felt that individual privacy, I feel that you should affirmatively be able to say, yes, you can share my information, as opposed to having the company force you to go to them to ask to not share the privacy information that you have. Thank you very much for the question.
Hi, Kelly McKenzie from Rosendale. According to the Commerce Department, corporate profits are at their highest level in at least 85 years, with after-tax profits annually amounting to around 10% of GDP. Meanwhile, employee compensation is at the lowest level in 65 years, and the gap between rich and poor has climbed to levels not seen since the 1920s. Corporations have not been investing much of their extra profits in workers and jobs, instead spending large portions on hefty CEO pay packages and business acquisitions that raise stock prices. So, given their record profits, why do you think corporations need a tax cut now? And if their taxes are reduced, what makes you think they will do things differently and contribute to an economy that works for all of us instead of trickling the profits up to the wealthy few?
Cutting into my time. So here's what I would say. We live in a global economy. All of these large U.S. companies, for instance, of the ones that you would typically cite, are companies that compete overseas. The U.S. corporate tax rate at 35% is among the highest in the world. So for instance, in Canada, the statutory tax rate is 15%. So Ireland, it's 12.5%. So many of the countries that we are competing against have much more favorable tax environments than the United States does. So here's the big problem as I see it. If you have a company, the biggest exporter in the United States is Boeing. Caterpillar is a big exporter. Obviously, our internet companies like Google and Apple make enormous amounts of money overseas as well. What is happening to the corporate profits that they earn overseas? They're being kept overseas. The United States multinational companies now have $2.7 trillion worth of U.S. corporate profits stashed abroad, not coming home. Why? Because the U.S. virtually alone among all of our international competitors would subject those profits, if they were brought home, to double taxation. So they pay, Boeing or GE pays taxes where they sell a product overseas. And then if they bring their profit home, they get taxed again in the U.S. So that's why you have $2.7 billion stashed abroad. It's called this concept of repatriation. So one reason why we should be looking at reforming the corporate tax system to make our companies more competitive, both domestically and internationally, is that we don't want them to have this perverse incentive to leave their profits overseas. So I agree with you. It's very easy to look at, whether it's the CEO salary or whether, frankly, it's a shortstop salary and say, my goodness, why do they have to earn so much? Frankly, I'm more inclined to let the market decide those things. But and shareholders and corporations, if they don't follow their shareholders' wishes, are going to find themselves taken over by someone else. So I do think though we need reform of our corporate tax law, primarily to deal with this problem of the lack of repatriation of those profits from overseas.
Can I ask a follow-up? According to the Government Accountability Office, the average effective tax rate of profitable corporations in the United States is around 14%. And also, it seems that in 1986, when under President Reagan, when those tax cuts happened for corporations in order to compete internationally, it was an international race to the bottom, and lots of other countries lowered their tax rates as a result.
Well, I think that when you talk about the effective tax rate, you have to consider the fact that that's one of the issues that we face. A lot of companies have lobbyists, and they've gone to Washington, and they have negotiated special deals for themselves to reduce their corporate tax rates. And so there are preferences and deductions and other special exemptions that have been created in the tax code. I mean, the tax code, look, is about 200 times longer than the Bible, for instance. I mean, it is grossly cumbersome. It is grossly complicated, and it makes it much more difficult for our companies, frankly, to compete overseas. So I want to see a leaner, flatter tax code where everyone pays their fair share and people don't benefit from special exemptions and deductions, which is exactly why you get an effective corporate tax rate of 14% for some companies. GE, for instance, many years pays 0. And it's because of special exemptions and deductions that, frankly, a lot of those should be eliminated from the tax code.
Do you commit to not voting for tax policy that will cut?
I think that our ground rules are that one follow-up question will be...
I'll give up my question to get Kelly's. I agree.
If you want to create a market for questions, that's a worthy implementation of Gerald and Faso's idea. Now let's move along. Let's move along in an orderly fashion.
I would only just add that my view is that this whole entire issue of tax reform is a very fluid thing. So I couldn't commit to vote for or against something that isn't even written yet. And I don't think you would expect me to do that. I want to read it, I want to know it, I want to understand it before I would commit my vote one way or the other.
Committing to a lower tax rate unless it was flat and there were no deductions.
So thank you. I'm going to call up the next two card holders. So Lorraine from Bearsville, if you would come up now. I'm sorry I didn't call you already. And Lisa Lindsley from Gardner. And hopefully we'll be able to come back to some of those other questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Faso, since you are willing to vote to defund Planned Parenthood, what do you have to say to the 8,000 patients in your district because of this defunding?
Well, my I've met Planned Parenthood and advocates for Planned Parenthood around the district. And my position was I didn't agree with that provision being in the legislation, but I also very clearly said that that would not be the determining factor of whether I would vote for or against the bill. So that's the simple answer to the question. So I did not agree with singling that organization out, but at the same time, the bill had many more other provisions in it. So that's where I came out
So
on.
what do you say to those 8,000 people?
I think that we'll proceed in an orderly fashion. And we have about 100 questions on these cards. We're not going to get to 100 questions, and we're going to get to far fewer if people start shouting out and extend applause. I'm not going to keep people from expressing themselves
It would be
in a
great if you
general
would answer
way.
the question the first time.
Yep.
answer.
Question is, we move on to the next question.
Civility. Follow-up?
The question
You have
was,
a follow-up?
what are you going to say to the 8,000 people in the district?
Well, the answer is what I just said to you, that this was in the legislative process. I didn't agree with its inclusion. I publicly said so, but I also said the final product may be very different. So I have to make my decision based upon the totality of the bill, not just on one provision within the bill. That is unfortunately, that's the nature of legislation. You don't get to pick and choose everything that you want. You have to vote on the final product as it comes through, and that's just the way it is. And I understand why someone would say, well, I don't agree with you because of that provision. Other people agreed with me because of other provisions. So I mean, that's just the nature of the beast.
How would you advocate?
Well, I publicly stated my position on it. I was one of the few Republicans that had adopted that provision. So I realize you don't agree with me, but I respect your opinion.
Following Lisa will be Robin Pearl-Schultz from New Paltz.
I'm Lisa Lindsay from Gardner.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi. President Trump campaigned on constructing a border wall that would not be paid for by U.S. taxpayers. Now we're hearing that important programs may be cut to pay for this ill-advised initiative. Will you commit to rejecting any budget that includes funding for a border wall?
The appropriations bill, the defense appropriation bill, which passed recently, and this is a perfect illustration of what I was just saying in response to the prior question. The defense appropriation bill had a military pay raise. It had increases in defense readiness, and if you've observed what's happened with some of our Navy ships in recent weeks and months, you can understand why we are greatly concerned about the lack of readiness and training. A lot of our military forces are stretched, they're overstressed because of the size and the length of the deployments that they are facing. So we also have weapons modernization systems, for instance, anti-missile defense.
Excuse me, I'm asking about the border wall.
And I'm getting to it. And so we have many provisions in the defense appropriation bill that I agreed with. We also had a provision in that bill, $1.6 billion for enhanced border security. Now, the president has labeled this as his quote-unquote wall. In actuality, it is most of this is routine upgrades and improvements, both technologically wise and barrier wise, along the southern border. I don't support building a wall on every nook and cranny of the U.S.-Mexico border. And also, I think it's not responsible to suggest that there's going to be a means and a way to say, quote-unquote, make Mexico pay for it. I've never agreed with that. So I do agree we need to make sure we enhance our border security. There are a lot of good reasons for that. I've also, for instance, supported a legislation that would really crack down on the ability of people to send synthetic drugs like fentanyl through the U.S. Postal Service into our communities. So that's a matter of border security as well. Those are one of the reasons why we need to make sure that we have an appropriate level of security to prevent the smuggling of drugs, for instance, across our border. So this $1.6 billion was contained within a much larger defense appropriation bill, which I supported. And building a wall on every nook and cranny of the border is not something that I would agree with, but I do support enhanced border security, and I think that's what that measure actually does.
So you've already voted for it? No wall. That's right.
Yes, you already
You
voted
didn't
for
answer
it.
her question.
Yes, you already voted for it. You voted yes. Build the wall.
Following Robin will be...
I voted yes on the defense appropriation bill, frankly, because that is one of the single most important things that we can do to protect the safety and security of our country. And one of the other things that we have in that defense appropriation bill, one of the other things we have is enhanced funding for missile defense. We need ballistic missile defense in this country.
We need to feed the poor.
And well, we need to feed the poor, but we need to protect everyone in this country from rogue states that would deliver ballistic missiles tipped with a nuclear weapon that could come into this country. So that's what we need.
One moment, Robin. Bill Barr, you're up next.
My name's Robin Pearl Shoulders, and I'm from New Paltz, New York. I'm here on behalf of my family. My stepbrother is black, my daughter's Hispanic, my nephew's transgender, and I'm Jewish. I'm here to ask what legislation you will support to address the rise in hate crime, and hate speech in our country.
I absolutely detest the neo-Nazis and skinheads and white nationalists that have demonstrated, like in Charlottesville a few weeks ago. I mean, it was just simply reprehensible. What is it about a neo-Nazi that we don't get, having lived just past the 20th century when we saw what they did? And so the bottom line is that I utterly reject that kind of philosophy. And so I think that the Justice Department and the states and local law enforcement need to vigorously prosecute. We do have adequate laws right now, and if there are gaps in those laws in terms of prosecuting hate crimes and other similar type crimes, then we should fill those gaps. But there is, I believe right now, there's sufficient legal authority, both at the national, at the state and local level, for us to prosecute those crimes. It is utterly reprehensible. And I totally agree with you.
I do have a follow-up. There's the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2010. Do you agree with the expansion of that act?
I'm not familiar with the exact provisions of the act, but I'll be happy. I have some staff here. We'll look at it and get back to you if you would talk to us after this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Following Bill will be Fabio Denisi.
My comment, my question is about the environment. While CEO of Exxon, Secretary Tillerson, acknowledged the existence of anthropogenic man-made global warming. And then the president, this is not connected, but the president, incident to this, has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, which, by the way, has sent a pretty strange message to the rest of the world about the U.S. keeping its treaties. But Secretary Tillerson, his instruction to his ambassadors was not only to not discuss anthropogenic global warming, but to encourage his country hosts to use more fossil fuel. So how can you, as one, I believe yourself, has acknowledged the existence of anthropogenic global warming, how can you support these policies of throwing future generations under the bus, essentially?
Well, I wouldn't support policies which would result in how you characterize it. I do think that the thing about, you mentioned the word treaty in terms of the Paris Accords. That's one of the problems with it. It wasn't a treaty.
Yeah, I understand.
And it's completely non-binding. And so the net effect of the Paris Accord was more symbolic in many ways than it was actually going to change behavior. I didn't agree with the removal of the U.S. from it because I felt we should keep a seat at the table on this issue as a means of pressuring other countries, particularly India and China, which are notorious in terms of not abiding by some of these kind of agreements. So that is something that the Chinese don't have a great record on being concerned in this regard. Now, I do think we should have stayed in it because we should have kept a seat at the table in this debate. We didn't because the president, I would have preferred if President Obama wanted that treaty, wanted that agreement to have the force of law, he should have submitted it to the Senate. He didn't do that. So, I mean, that's...
Obama blaming against the reason that they weren't going to get a treaty.
So the bottom line is that we had an agreement that was non-enforceable. So I do disagree with his decision, but I think that its impact is actually much less than is being represented.
Well, just one point, China has actually jumped out ahead in supporting sustainable energy. You didn't answer, how, look, we have the CEO of Exxon as our Secretary of State. We have another oil man as our Secretary of Energy. It's clear that this administration is all about selling more fossil fuel, despite the evidence that leads to global warming.
It's important for everyone to recognize that the CO2 emissions in the U.S. and in New York State, for instance, have declined over 20% in the last 20 years. And there's a reason for that. We're using a lot less coal, and that's better for the environment. And we're using more natural gas to replace coal, and that results in fewer emissions that are harmful. Some want to immediately move away from all fossil fuels. It is not, in my view, it is not a completely practical thing, but the market is moving in this direction. And I think that's useful and productive. After all, we have a 20% reduction in CO2 emissions because of market forces more than anything else. Markets work better than government regulation.
We're going to continue to move through to cover as many topics as possible and hope to return to some of these with some of the other questions that are in the pile. But we really wanted to make sure we give as many people here a chance to ask their questions. Following Fabio Denisi is Justin Tracy.
I'm Fabio Denisi, Congressman. You knew I was going to ask about healthcare. So I believe we all agree that we went from a disastrous healthcare public policy before Obamacare to a slightly more equitable but still flawed healthcare policy with Obamacare. You've been in healthcare policy for a long time. I believe you've also had some lobbying with healthcare and healthcare insurance companies. What role do you think the healthcare insurance lobby has in promoting legislation that keeps us from having a sane, equitable healthcare policy? Our healthcare system is horrific, and your party, and you voted for a monstrosity of a bill that would defies logic, to me at least, how there are many, many models of equitable universal healthcare systems that work, and we simply will not even consider it. Because of the massive amounts of money that the healthcare industry pours into Washington.
Doctor, you and I are not going to agree on this topic.
No,
we have met many times, and I very much respect your point of view. I don't agree with a single-payer system, okay? And I do think the crux of a lot of your argument was about the health insurance industry, which I, by the way, parenthetically, I never worked for. So the health insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry were the key players in enacting the Affordable Care Act. And everyone should recognize that. So, but the system, what they did, and my concern about the ACA, was that instead of approaching the 40 to 45 million people who did not have health insurance or whose employer did not provide health insurance, they changed the system for the 170 million people who did have employer-provided health insurance. And so I had many constituents who came to me and said, ACA was a lifesaver to them, or the Medicaid expansion was a lifesaver to them, and I acknowledge that. And I have many constituents who came to me and said, this has driven the cost of my premiums and deductibles sky high, and it has made it much more difficult for us. And the Washington Post, not exactly a conservative beacon, they did their fact checker back in 2012 or 13, and they said the representation of the administration that if you liked your health care plan, you could keep it, and if you liked your doctor, you could keep it. They said, not me, they said it was the lie of the year. So the bottom line is that the healthcare efforts did not succeed. You should be happy because your point of view won. So what I'm trying to do now with the Problem Solvers Caucus, with Democrats and Republicans, find areas where we can agree, where you can get Democrats and Republicans in the same room and find some principles that we can agree. Because, at the end of the day, the average person in our country and the average person in the 19th Congressional District doesn't really care about the ideological arguments that may go on between the parties in Washington. They want to know, is this going to help me and my family? What's the cost going to be? Am I going to be able to buy coverage? That's what they want to know. So what we've come up with a couple of simple principles. One, we would agree to fund and appropriate the funds for the CSRs, the premium support that is given for poor people, lower income people, to reduce the cost of their premiums and deductibles. That is something that is, they're called the CSRs or the CRSs, the cost reduction subsidies. These are something that the Obama administration, the Republican Congress last year, John Boehner 2 years ago, went to court because Obama had moved money, what they said at the time was illegally. Well, the courts agreed. They said the president didn't have the power to move that money. This is what the president now is saying, oh, he may withdraw those subsidies, but he hasn't done it, and I don't agree with doing it. So one of the things that we're agreeing on is we should fund those cost reduction subsidies, because that's important to keeping insurance affordable for lower income people. Second, the Democrats have agreed to us that the employer mandate at the 50 threshold level, 50 employees, is way too low. And they've agreed to go up to 500, which will solve a lot of problems for small business employers, especially in an area like ours. And so they've agreed to do that. They've also agreed with us to establish a reinsurance system, which was initially in the ACA and only funded for about a year. And they've agreed with us that we should have a reinsurance system so that the insurers, when they write these policies, can be protected against the liability for the really high-cost cases, and that this would be a subsidy that the federal government would cover. And the theory is this will lower premiums and deductibles for everyone else. They've also agreed with us. The Democrats and Republicans have agreed, and this is something even Elizabeth Warren agrees with, to eliminate the medical device tax, because it has really decimated the medical device industry in our country. We have a bunch of those in upstate New York. So we've agreed on that, and we've also agreed on some flexibility and limited circumstances for states that's highly technical. But those are the things that we agreed to before August. We believe we can get bipartisan consensus to pass such a thing. And on September 5th, when we go down to Washington, we're going to meet with Senator Alexander and Senator Patty Murray and other senators, Democrat and Republican, to try to get a consensus so that we can pass this. Because again, at the end of the day, the American people want us to move the ball forward, and they want us to keep the lights on. So that's what they want us to do.
But Congressman, if you agree to raise the minimum to 500 employees, what's going to happen to the 499 employees that don't get health insurance?
No, what it is you're basically what that mandate does. It has discouraged employment for many employers. It has not meant that they didn't provide health insurance. It just meant that they had extra added taxes and burdens that they had to pay once they went over 50. So I had employers in this district tell me they won't go over 50 people because of the added burden of the employer mandate. It makes it much more difficult to hire people. And the two things that people say to me the most in this district, the two things are, my kids and my grandchildren have to leave because there are no jobs, and I'm going to leave because my property taxes are too high when I retire. That's what they say more than any other thing in this district. I want to make it so that employers are encouraged to hire people. And you know what? I talk to employers all the time. I tour plants, I visit with employers, I talk to employees. There are a lot of jobs out there, but a lot of employers are telling me they can't find people who meet the qualifications that they need. And so this is employment and training is a big thing that we need to be working on as well.
Medicare for all would be way cheaper.
agree on that concept. And in fact, when they tried it in Vermont, Bernie Sanders' home state, they had to withdraw it because they found out they couldn't afford it. California, they didn't pass it because they realized they couldn't afford it. Well, it is in my view, in my view, no, we're not being civil. In my view, the fact is that these systems, they have to have a financial stability. And I haven't yet to see one of those single-payer systems that does.
Massachusetts.
I think we're going to move on to the next question.
Next up, following Justin, will be Tom Perglinski.
Hi there. My name is Justin Tracy. You're probably sick of hearing it. I have a podcast with my wife called Spotlight 19, and we track your voting record, and we discuss various things in this District 19. And why I said that you're probably sick of hearing my name is kind of related to this question. Now I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to put it into context after that. So it's a yes or no question. Will you commit to more transparency with how messages and constituents' communications are passed along to you? And to put that into context, I have a couple of notes.
Wait a second, do I get to answer yes or no?
Sure.
Okay. So,
yes or no, though. No, you don't get to answer anything but yes or no. That's the question. You do it?
yes.
Thank you very much.
And then I'll explain some more afterwards.
Sure. Well, you're going to do it whether I want it or not. So this is my issue. Now it's a personal issue because we are trying to communicate about what's happening as far as your office is concerned. We have called you, my wife and I have called you on a regular basis, sometimes almost daily. Obviously not you directly, but your office in DC and also in Kingston. We don't get any response from you. If we do, it's like, it takes 5 months, and it's a standard response. I understand we're just one or two people, but when it's questions like, if you would fail to wish Muslims a happy Eid Mubarak, or other issues as far as Islamophobia and hate crime, those issues are really important to us. You did take 48 hours to respond to the Charlottesville attack. So for us, because you don't post on your schedule in advance, it's hard to find out what you're doing, where you're going to be, so we can hold you accountable. Another thing is that when we've asked your staff in DC how are messages being translated to the congressman, we have a mixed response. Some of them say we're writing it down on a yellow sticky note. Another one says we have a legal pad. I'm not making this stuff up. There's another thing that apparently you're using. It's some kind of software system that as soon as somebody told us that you were using it, everyone was apparently told not to mention it again. It's called Fireside 21. So this should be transparent, and other congressmen and women, and our senator was in Kingston. Gerald was in Kingston and giving a marvelous open town hall. What are you going to do? What do you say to your constituents that cannot communicate with you and don't get any response back from you?
Well, Justin, here are a couple of things that I would say. I appreciate your coming. In our office, since we took office in January, and this is not just me, it is replicated all throughout the country, we have had over 75,000 communications from constituents. And we have done our best to respond to those. We have a limited staff. we have a limited capacity to respond in a manner that I would like, frankly. The voicemail system, for instance, in the House of Representatives can take 25 voicemails and that's it. And so we've had, at a level, we tracked, one of my staffers worked for, a couple of our staffers worked for Chris Gibson. And they were able to plot on a graph all of the interactions that Chris had over 6 years with constituents. As soon as January happened, the interactions went up at a level of 4 times. So it's extraordinarily difficult to respond as quickly as you would want. I would also note that I've had well over 400 meetings now with constituents to talk about issues. And I certainly, would wish everyone a happy holiday, regardless of their religious faith. I didn't wait 48 hours to respond to Charlottesville. I was actually out of the country in Israel at the time on a congressional trip. And I heard about this about 9 o'clock at night when we were out, concluding dinner. And I had very little information as to what happened. As soon as I returned at 4 a.m. in Newark Airport on the following Monday, I heard it at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night Israel time. When I returned into Newark at 4 a.m., later that day, I think by noon or so, I put out a statement condemning the neo-Nazis, etc. So I didn't wait to do that. And so I look forward, if you want me to come on you have a radio podcast.
I've invited you 6 times.
Okay.
I've spoken to you directly.
So now that you've done it the 7th time, I'll do it. Justin, you will wait no more.
All right, we'll see about that.
What's the best way for him to contact you?
He knows how to get
Following Tom will be Mark Ryder.
Congressman Faso, you represent a district that is close to... You represent a district that is close to evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, yet your record reflects an 87.8% alignment with the policy preferences of Donald J. Trump. As a Democrat, how can you, myself as a Democrat, how can you claim to be representing my interests? And secondly, how can you claim to represent the interests of all your constituents in the 19th Congressional District with that kind of voting record in lockstep with President Trump?
Well, first thing I would say is that the percentage you cite is based upon a categorization which the 538 website has come up with. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that they select certain things to count in the calculation. For instance, they don't count any votes on amendments. And on the time when I've broken with my party and voted for different things or voted against different things, that doesn't appear. For instance, when I voted against the amendment that said the Defense Department can no longer take climate change into consideration in terms of its military preparedness and where its bases will be, that vote isn't in there. When there was a vote on whether to bar transgender people automatically from the military, that vote is not in there. I voted against that amendment with 24 other Republicans. So I would just tell you that my experience is you should never take an analysis that someone does like that without really going behind the veil and trying to figure out, well, what actually are they using to come up with the calculation? Because I would suggest to you that not all of these evaluations and percentages that you'll see are actually a true reflection of the reality.
Congressman, if you're not voting in complete lockstep with Trump, then why don't we see you actively advocating your disagreements with him? I mean, you were elected to be a leader. What I expect from you is to go out, if you honestly do, and not just issue a statement, get out there on the news shows and say, I disagree with the president on Charlottesville.
I could only get everything that I say and all my statements covered by the press. The fact is that not everything I would say and not everything I will do gets covered by the press. And one of the things that you learn in this process is that the media has stories that they're covering, and it's not necessarily something that you're talking about. So I would just...
Yeah, why don't you use your website more?
Well, you will find all my statements on my website. You will find, for instance, the first immigration order that the president made very early in his administration, that I disagreed with that executive order that he issued. And I said that it was of dubious constitutionality and probably would be stricken by the courts. You know, that's just the way it is. But I don't agree with your characterization. And the other thing is that there are certain things the president has done that I agree with. I agree with the appointment of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. I think that will... And I also believe that we have to rebuild our, we have to really focus on building our missile defense technology, because this is vitally important for us to deal with rogue regimes like North Korea, with regimes like Iran. And I agree, for instance, that we have a strong relationship with the State of Israel. I am vehemently against the BDS movement. I don't believe the boycott sanctions movement against Israel is advisable. I think that they are a true ally of ours in that part of the world, and I think that we need to stand foursquare with them on these issues. So that's something that you'll see that I will agree with President Trump. It's just, look, when I ran last year, I said if regardless of who was elected, Mrs. Clinton or Mr. Trump, I said if I agreed with them, I would support them. If I disagreed with them, I would not support them. That's the policy that I've continued with.
May I just respectfully suggest the next time that you disagree with President Trump, try to get on a news program. A Republican disagreeing with President Trump would probably be there.
I think the next question will prove a follow-up. I'm going to hand this to Mark Ryder, and next up will be Karen Markinsis.
Hello, Mark Ryder. First, I think it would be a shame if we left this meeting and not acknowledge that there's many people suffering who have lost everything down in Texas. So I know, all of our thoughts and prayers are going out.
Mark, thank you for that. And I just want to tell you that we had a very really philanthropically minded citizen out in Delaware County who arranged to have a tractor trailer full of bottled water that a company donated to him to take down, and I arranged with a fellow member of Congress in Louisiana, where they're getting a lot of the people coming in from Texas and also places in Louisiana. So we were able to facilitate bringing that bottled water to those folks down there. So anyone that can help through the Red Cross, they need money. And your thoughts and prayers for those people that have been so adversely affected. Really, thank you for bringing it up.
So my question has to do with, you mentioned that you made a statement on Charlottesville. You made another statement on Sheriff Joe Arpaio, but many of your constituents still feel that you have condemned our president really enough in those statements. And so I wanted to ask, do you still feel that Donald Trump is fit to be our president?
Yeah.
I would simply point out that Donald Trump was elected president. Donald Trump won this congressional district as well. So I would respectfully suggest that you really need to take a look at the election results. The election results in this congressional district. He won this district by about 6 points. I won by about 8.5 points.
Nixon also won his election.
And I would point out, sometimes sometimes the voters make a mistake. I mean, I ran against Elliot Spitzer, and 14 months later, he had to resign for doing things he shouldn't have been doing. So I would respectfully suggest they made a mistake that time.
Answer the question.
So that falls right into my follow-up. I guess you believe Spitzer was a mistake, but I wonder if you believe that Trump was a mistake, and that if brought in front of the House of Representatives, a lot of things have come out in the last 8 months. Would you support an impeachment hearing?
Yeah.
At the present time, certainly not.
Wow.
Following Karen is Leslie Burlian.
Actually, when I was coming here, I began to ponder what I would ask. I had so many questions. So I actually reached out to a whole bunch of people in my contact list who aren't necessarily affiliated with any particular group. They weren't affiliated with any particular committee. And just to get a general idea of what they would ask you. This is what I came up with. And it has been addressed a bit before, so I'm sorry if it's redundant. 2 parts, basically. How would you characterize the Trump administration's approach to immigration and civil rights? And how will you use the power of your office to speak out against the Trump administration's xenophobia regarding foreigners, gays, lesbians, transgenders, and of course racism?
Immigration. The thing that people in agriculture, and this is a very big agriculture district, talk to me the most about is not problems with the Department of Labor. It's not pesticide regulation. It's not even, if they're dairy farmers, it's the price of milk. You know what they talk to me the most about? The failure to have an adequate supply of labor. And the concern that many of their workers who are here have about the kind of atmosphere that they perceive out there. So one of the things that I have done, first I opposed the executive order that the president issued back in January. Second, though, I've co-sponsored legislation that would deal with the children who were brought here as children to the United States illegally. But those people have grown up in the United States, and I've sponsored legislation. I've been a co-sponsor of 2 pieces of legislation that would deal in an appropriate way with those folks by allowing them to stay in the country. They'd have to report, they'd have to do the things if they're getting an education or they go into the military. There'll be means by which they can stay in the country and work and go to school, etc. Because it's vitally important that we not toss these folks out, presuming that they haven't committed a crime. The second thing that I want to share with you is that back on the agricultural front, this is an issue that it doesn't matter if the farmer is an organic farmer or a regular conventional farmer, a dairy farmer, a fruit, crop, vegetable, all of them talk about labor. In September, there's going to be a legislative proposal that I anticipate supporting that the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee is going to introduce, and that will create what's called an H-2C visa program. The H-2C visa program would say, if you're an agricultural worker in the United States and you're not here legally, that you can stay in the country, that there'll be certain requirements of your staying, which is number one, you haven't committed a crime, but if you meet the criteria, and the vast majority of these people are skilled agricultural workers and they're really needed in this country, if you touch back in your country for a total of 45 days over a 3-year period, you have permission under the visa system to stay in the country. That's approximately 3 million people, agricultural workers, who are not legally in the country today, that we would permit to stay, and we would allow for up to 500,000 new agricultural visas to come into the country. So both my statements, my rhetoric, and the bills that I have supported indicated that I believe that we need to fix this immigration problem that we have, And the best way to do it would be to create a legal process for people to resolve their status so they can stay and work or get an education in the United States. Yeah, I'm a firm believer in civil rights. I was one of the first Republicans many years ago in the state assembly that supported the so-called SONDA bill, Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act. So, I believe every American should be given the fair opportunity and should not be discriminated against. And I also believe that I love the song America the Beautiful. America the Beautiful is a wonderful song, but the second verse goes, I'm not going to sing it, thankfully, for all of you, but there's a line in it in the second verse that says, God, mend thy every flaw. America has flaws. We all know that. But we are always striving to improve our country. And that is the democratic ideal. I believe in the national motto of the United States, which is E pluribus unum, out of many one. I'm a product of Irish Italian immigrants that came many years ago to this country, and I'm very proud of that. And I think that the immigration system should be one that's welcoming, but at the same time, we should insist that people follow the law and a legal process to come here. Because it's vitally important, as I mentioned before, in terms of drugs and other issues, that we make sure that we have secure borders.
Something that Trump was doing legislation.
Yeah, that's the DACA. This is what happened. President Obama did an executive order allowing the dreamers, the people that came here as children, to stay in the country. Now, he did this after saying, I think the recorded times he said that he didn't have the power to do it was about 20 or 22 times. Then he did it after the November 2014 elections. It is now being litigated, and this is something that, frankly, there is a real question as to whether the president had the power to do that. I'm skeptical that he did the way he did it, because he himself, up until the time he did it, said he didn't have the power. So that's why I'm co-sponsoring legislation to do it the way it should be done, which is to pass a law passed by the people's representatives to deal with this question. So that's the same issue as the DREAM Act.
Following Leslie will be Regina.
Hi, I'm Leslie Burlier from Cooperstown. I think I might get the award for coming the furthest.
I don't know, Franklin or Cooperstown, I'm not sure which is...
Cooperstown is further. I picked him up on the way.
Touche.
So we've talked before, and I was glad to hear you talk about civility. However, you talked in your opening remarks about how we're watching different news, the left and the right. Right? The left is watching MSNBC, the right is watching Fox. The right is also reading Breitbart.
Yes, sure.
And Breitbart has been the linchpin of the alt-right, and they have given ideas and language and safe harbor to white supremacists and racists. And when Steve Bannon left the White House, his first meeting was with the Mercers, who you know, because they give you money. And I want to know, if you're really serious about this, if you're really serious about civility, and you're really serious about elevating the conversation and taking hate out of the equation, are you willing to say you will not take money from people who fund things like Breitbart that elevate hate?
So I personally have never read Breitbart, and so
I can tell you some of the headlines.
Well, I don't follow
Renegade Jew, single women are ugly.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, that kind of stuff is reprehensible, and I don't subscribe to it. And I think you'll find, by the way in which I've conducted myself in public office, that I certainly don't
Yes
subscribe
or no?
to
Are
that.
you willing to disavow money from people who support things like Breitbart that support hate speech? Yes or no? And it would be a very popular thing to say you disavow.
Well, I can tell you that I do know Mr. Mercer. I have never once ever heard him say anything.
He gives them money.
So we're gonna agree to disagree on this point. We're gonna agree to disagree on this point. And you know,
Wow, you are something else.
You know,
so we're gonna agree to disagree, but I do.
I don't agree.
Okay. There we go.
Sing America the Beautiful.
Following Regina, is Regina here? Following Regina will be Rosa Lazarde.
I seem to have a bit more of a lightweight question, but what do you plan to do about proposed budget cuts to social services, the EPA, National Park Services, consumer protection, things like this? I mean, there have already been impacts on wildlife, on consumer protection, on safety issues for pharmaceuticals and other things. We're just getting out of control when it comes to the people themselves having to fight for everything that we need. Medication is not tested properly, or if it is, it's tested by the pharmaceutical companies. It should be independently tested. We should look at our animals. We need to take care of our wildlife. We need to take care of our environment. It is really, really something that I find. I don't have kids, so when I die, who cares? You know, the world will go, if it blows up, who cares? You know, but there are other people, and there are other creatures that inhabit this earth. And I was raised as a Catholic and a Christian with respect for nature, with respect for the environment, with respect for all living creatures. So I think that is something that we need to look at and be the leaders in the world, which we were, through Humane Society and SPCA and other organizations.
Well, thank you for the question. Here, I think you will find that the vast majority of the cuts that were proposed by the Trump administration that we have either already rejected or will soon reject in appropriations bills. And so I think most of your concerns will have been addressed in that regard. I was up in the doing the Appalachian Trail today. I'm a big sponsor of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and that's why those groups were very appreciative of the fact that I have made either a sponsor or a co-sponsor of many pieces of legislation that address the very things that you're concerned about. But let's also, here's another issue that we have to face as a country, and this is, you know, we live in this kind of 10-second attention span society, what I call Kardashianized, where people know more about what the Kardashians are doing than knowing what is actually going on in our country. And we are now in a situation where the national debt is $19 trillion. It is on the trend to go to $29 trillion in just 10 years. Now, what will happen if we go to $29 trillion, the third largest item in the federal budget after Medicare and Social Security, will be interest on the debt. That will be a catastrophic situation that all of us will have to deal with. And we are basically imposing this debt and this burden on our children and grandchildren. And
Tax the rich!
And so the bottom line is that we have got to address this issue, we've got to reform, and we've got to grow faster in the economy. This is another reason why I would like to see tax and regulatory relief that will inspire more private sector job growth in our country, more investment. That creates more wealth and it creates more opportunity and more jobs. That's what we need.
The other part of my question was, federal workers are also a part of the workforce. You lay them off, you're going to have an increase in unemployment. That's one thing. But will you vote to increase the debt ceiling? Or will you shut down the government?
No, I've stated any number of occasions that I would vote to increase the debt ceiling. And it's important for people to understand what exactly that is. That basically says the United States government is going to pay for the debt that they've already accumulated. It doesn't mean that you're accumulating new debt. It means that the 19 trillion that we have today in our national debt, which is the equivalent of about $60,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States, and about $120,000 for every taxpayer in the United States. That debt is an extraordinary burden. If we get to a situation where the third largest item in the federal budget after Social Security and Medicare is interest on the debt, it will be a catastrophic situation for our country. It will restrict capital and investment to small business. It will make it much more difficult for us to fund programs that many of us would like to see funded, and it will make the future much more dangerous and much more difficult for our children and grandchildren. So that's really something that virtually no one pays attention to. At 19 trillion is, for those that are counting, 19,000 billion. It's a little difficult to get your arms around that, but this is the trend that we are on as a country, and it is catastrophic if we allow it to happen. Now that I put everyone to sleep.
Following Rosa, we are watching our time, trying to get in as many questions as possible. It's Kathy Adden and then Tim Hunter.
Thank you. First of all, let me say I'm a member of the Move Forward New York. And if we can have a big cheer again for the organizers of this event. Congressman, this will refer back to some mention of the Dreamers Act.
Yeah.
I might have to amend my question a bit, but as a Mexican American and a member of the Latino community, I strongly support the DREAM Act of 2017. And the young people protected by this bill are contributors to our economy, veterans of the military, academic standouts in our universities, and leaders in our communities. Among these protected in this bill are recipients of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, a program that has benefited over 800,000 young people. DACA has ensured that recipients are able to live their lives free of fear and anxiety that they will be deported at any time to a country they do not know, and they will be separated from their families. In your introductory remarks, you mentioned we want the best for our children. We believe immigrant youth deserve continued protection and a path to citizenship. You also just mentioned that you are co-sponsoring a bill.
2 bills.
2 bills. It's not on your website. I checked. Well, if it could be up front and center, because that type of information is what we want to see, and I salute the colleague before who asked for more transparency. I would agree fully that we need increased transparency to push for accountability. And I want to ask, you said you support the DACA program. Yes, I want to make sure. If you can provide specifics of these 2 co-sponsorship bills, and also what immigrant constituency advocacy groups you've consulted for this? Who are you working with? You're working with farmers, agricultural companies, and if you don't have advocates working with you, I volunteer right now to help you out, and I'm sure there's others here who will help out as well.
Thank you for your letters. I remember.
It's Rosa.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rosa. First, I've met with a number of immigrant advocates who've been in my office in Washington, and I've met with folks here in Kingston. Also, I would point out to folks, and this is just parenthetically an advertisement of our casework, we have helped many people resolve their immigration status or resolve their visa status, and also help them attain their citizenship status here in the United States. I was privileged just 2 weeks ago to speak at a naturalization ceremony in Albany that one of the federal judges invited me to speak at. There were 55 new citizens, and I can tell you, and Mary Frances will tell you, that when I got home, I said how completely invigorating and inspiring it was to see these new citizens coming up and getting their paper and getting their certificate and taking a photo with us with their kids. And that, it gives you hope and confidence and inspiration about our future as Americans. So happy, Rosa, to talk to you some more about
The
this question.
specifics of the two bills.
Okay, the
Can
two
you provide that information
bills,
right
one
now?
is sponsored by Mike Kaufman from Colorado. It's a bipartisan bill. Another is sponsored by Carlos Cabello from Florida, another bipartisan bill. And one would simply allow those folks to stay in the country, presuming they give them privilege to work and get an education, etc. Another was, the Cabello bill is more encompassing, where it would say, it would give you specific steps if you want to go in the military or if you have a job where you can basically in the future become a citizen. But in order to become a citizen, you got to get online behind everyone else who's already online to become a citizen. So that's a vitally important thing. We have to respect the rule of law in our immigration process, and that's something that has been missing in a lot of this discussion. So I would encourage you, the fellow standing back by the Coke machine, Jeff Bishop on my staff in Washington, he does a lot of work and is very conversant on those two bills, and he can give you the bill numbers, etc., that you can follow up with us.
All right, Bill, raise your hand.
Jeff.
Jeff, sorry.
See, it's not just me that does that. Rosa, thank you. I'll try to be shorter so we can get more questions here.
Hello, Congressman. I'm Kathy Aden.
I remember your letters. Okay.
You voted for a health care bill that was estimated by the CBO to cost $24 million to lose insurance over the next decade, and tens of thousands in our district to lose insurance as well. The bill weakens pre-existing conditions, which you promised to safeguard, to one seriously ill constituent. Do you now regret your vote for a bill that even President Trump called mean?
First, let me say I don't agree with CBO's analysis on this topic. For instance, CBO, for instance, when the ACA was enacted, said that by this time in 2017 there'd be 23 or 22 million people on the exchanges. There are between 8 and 9 million people on the exchanges. So their estimates were wildly off on that. The other point that I would make is that the CBO counted in their number the people who currently, there's 6.5 million people who are paying the penalty, the fine, rather than buying the insurance. So they counted in that 22 million number the people who are currently paying a fine so they don't have to buy the insurance. So I think some of their analysis, they are very good when it comes to saying, well, what the deficit's going to be, how much a particular program is going to cost. They are not very good, in my view, when they are subject to subjective points of view. What will human behavior, how will people change their behavior in light of changed circumstances? So what I'm trying to do now, because the legislation failed, What I'm trying to do now is, again, as I enunciated before, come up with bipartisan solutions that both Democrats and Republicans can agree with, because there are a lot of features of the ACA that are not working. So that's really what my position is, and I hope that we can get something accomplished this year.
To follow up, are you going to be supporting strengthening the Affordable Care Act so that coverage is expanded universally?
I would like to fix the flaws in it, and I would also like, however, to create more options for people through tax credits to buy insurance outside of the exchanges. So, that's what I would like. But there are some good things, as I said before, about it. And you referenced Medicaid. Someone was on Medicaid who has a pre-existing condition. Those folks aren't even affected by this question because Medicaid does not do health underwriting.
In this state, I think.
No, anywhere in the country. Medicaid is income-based. They do not do health underwriting. So someone who's on Medicaid does not have an issue relating to pre-existing conditions because there is no health underwriting in the Medicaid system.
Just a quick moment before Tim asks his question. There was a set of lost keys found, so if you can't get home later.
I think that's my card.
I might raffle them off then. And then Rashid Tyler will follow Tim.
Congressman Faso, thank you very much for taking this.
Good evening.
3 years ago, my wife had breast cancer. And we had to fight. The free market is not very kind. We had to fight our insurance company, 7 lawyers from the New York State Department of Financial Services, and New York State Attorney General's office to get the coverage that she was just entitled to. Last year, for the leukemia, which she unfortunately got from the chemo, we had Obamacare. It's just unbelievable, the difference. She was treated in the finest Manhattan hospital, which previously would have been deemed out of network. Now, had she survived, she would have been placed in one of Paul Ryan's high-risk pools. And you, Congressman, were the tie-breaking vote that brought this out of committee.
That's right.
You were the vote that voted yes on the floor. And you yourself even penned an op-ed in the Daily News in favor of this bill. These high-risk pools would limit coverage, make premiums unaffordable, effectively having the same consequences as the fictional death panels that Sarah Palin warned of. Now, Medicare for All would bring coverage to 100% and lower costs by removing the profits for the insurance companies, from which you received $24,400 this year alone. Now, I know you just downgraded the accuracy of the CBO, but perhaps a lot of the reason that there wasn't as much coverage as there should have been was a lot of Republican governors were not taking advantage of the federal money, so it was not really submarining Obamacare as a political ploy. Now, the CBO says that over 20 million people, 15 million, 20 million, 24 million, does it really matter? 1 person, 1 million person, people would have lost coverage. That's the bottom line. In your district alone, 20,000 people would have lost coverage. So in Ulster County, 20,000 would have lost coverage. In the district, 65,000. And 290,000 people in your district with pre-existing conditions were at risk of losing coverage. I'm one of those.
It's a human right.
Now, and this was only to offset the tax break for billionaires, and wait for it, insurance companies. Now, knowing this, how is it that the decent thing to do? How can you possibly justify the death of thousands of people for a tax break for the rich? And I believe that every single American has the right to basic health care. Do you?
Amen.
first let me say I'm sorry for your loss. And anyone that goes through that deals with unbearable suffering, and I very much am sorry for what you had to deal with in your family. Second, I believe that you have grossly mischaracterized my position and the effect of the legislation.
You voted.
I voted for it because I believe that it would improve the healthcare system. And we have a different point of view on this. But here is where we stand now. Rather than relitigate the questions previously, what I'm trying to suggest is that we should be trying to find areas where we can find common ground and where we can agree to fix some of the flaws that are in the system. I mean, you say, for instance, it was a tax break for insurance companies. In actual point of fact, the taxes that are imposed both by New York State and by the ACA go right through to premium payers. There's no free lunch, folks. Those taxes don't affect insurance companies. They go right to the premiums that people pay. And here's what the problem was. Rather than trying to fix the system that 45 million people didn't have coverage, whether they didn't have employer-provided coverage or they simply didn't have it because they were poor, they could have been eligible for Medicaid. Rather than doing that, instead, what the ACA did is they changed the system for the 170 million people that have employer-provided coverage. And that's why we have this conflict on this topic. Because, and again, the political lie of the year in 2013, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. It turned out not to be true. It turned out not to be true.
Can I agree with you on that? Give you a specific?
Sure.
We were not able to keep our doctor. The wonderful doctor that we had in Kingston, Dr. Samira Kara, who performed my wife's mastectomy, was kicked off of MVP healthcare because she was victorious too many times at getting coverage for her patients. So they denied her as a provider. She had to go up to Columbia County. Now, do you know that MVP healthcare delayed my wife's mastectomy by weeks and weeks while they played this out? It's just the free market is not kind. And you keep referring, here's, by the way, the op-ed in the New York Times from Representatives Gottheimer and Tom Reed of the problem solvers.
The problem solvers, right.
Which I do want to say, I would congratulate you for a deft political move, I would say, cynically, but realistically, we do need to all work together. However, there are 4 steps in this op-ed in the New York Times from the chairs of your committee. 4 steps to fixing the problems with Obamacare. Not replacing Obamacare, not repealing Obamacare, but fixing the problems with it, making it better. So at this point, can you commit to us that you have, since you were the poster child for Obamacare, have you 180 degrees changed your position and you're willing to keep Obamacare and just make it better?
Here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to keep what works and fix what doesn't. And that's really quite simple.
Now.
Yeah, that's exactly.
You're telling me you have changed your position.
No, what I'm telling you is that we have to accommodate to the changed circumstances. It's apparent the public doesn't want us to be arguing back and forth on philosophy on this topic. What the Democrats say and what the Republicans say and what the different philosophies are, most of the public has tuned a lot of that out. What they want us to do is try to come together, get Democrats and Republicans in the room and find areas where we can agree and find areas where we can move the healthcare system forward in a productive way. And I view that as my responsibility as a legislator. You know, you don't get everything you want in life, and you certainly don't get it in the legislative process. But I do think if we in good faith sit together and talk these things through, we can come up with resolutions to these problems. And I greatly sympathize for what happened in your wife's specific situation. I really empathize with what you're saying, and I believe, I respect the sincerity and the way you represent your point of view on this. And I hope we can work together as Democrats and Republicans to fix the problem.
But that won't happen unless you have to let the person acknowledge that you've been right.
We'd like to take 2 more questions before closing, as we promised we would.
I'm sorry, I just have to say, that won't happen unless you acknowledge that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. That's right. Okay?
So we're gonna recognize 2 more people.
Life, we all want what he has.
Faso. My name is Rashida Tyler, and I actually met with you back in February. I don't know if you remember or not.
I do.
I actually want to take us back to the basics here. And so first I want to say thank you for being here tonight. You know, it takes a lot to come out and be with constituents and face a lot of people who may have different opinions. My question is really about good governance. Specifically, the principles of openness, transparency, and accountability. Openness and transparency being necessary to hold public officials accountable. My question specifically is, do you feel that a public official, an elected official, that makes themselves unavailable or inaccessible to the public is abdicating their duties to uphold these principles?
Yeah, and what I've done with over almost 400 meetings around my district, with a televised live TV town hall, I've made myself accessible. I talk to constituents all the time. I go to events all the time. I sincerely want to hear from people's point of view, regardless of how rude or extreme they might be.
So if I could do a follow-up just quickly, you know, I actually have met many people who have called your office, you know, DC, Kingston, Kinderhook, and they cannot get a hold of anyone. And we actually give accolades to your staff because they are very polite when we are able to make contact to go inside. But we have found you particularly to be someone that has not upheld the principles that we would expect in a public official, regardless of your party.
Well, I just respectfully disagree. And I note that you're from Citizen Action. I've met with Citizen Action in my office. The fact that Citizen Action vocally and avidly opposed my election last year didn't matter to me. I met with your organization. I'll continue to meet with people. It is not just meeting with people you agree with. It's meeting and talking to people that you may not agree with. And so I'm happy that we've had this opportunity tonight to do just that.
Well, I will actually allow other people to come up and get some more questions. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our final question will be from Sue Sullivan.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm from the town of Platicille. I just want to say that I graduated from Cooperstown High School, so I know where that is, rather than Franklin. Since January, I've traveled this district, and I've spoken to Republicans and Democrats alike, because that is not important to me. What is important to me is people. The number one issue that I hear over and over is the need for jobs and hope for the future. Yesterday, the president launched his most recent publicity campaign, tax reform. There are no details except the goal of slashing corporate tax rates from 35% to 15%. Months of private negotiations between the Trump staff and congressional representatives have resulted in zero legislation. Economists agree that there is scant evidence that cutting the tax rate stimulates more investments, boosts wages, and creates jobs. There's widespread recognition that those tax cuts boost corporate profits and benefit the wealthiest Americans. Your constituents are hurting right now, and action is needed. Here's my question. When are you going to stand up for the interests of the 19th District, calling to task the hurtful sound bites that are dividing our country? What specifically do you propose, with substance please, that would serve the 19th Congressional District most successfully in terms of tax reform?
There's a reason why tax reform hasn't been accomplished since 1986. It's really difficult. And every single provision in the tax code has defenders. Every single provision in the tax code will be very strongly fought for by those that benefit from it. And so what we've got to do is, the president's proposal, you're right, he hasn't introduced legislation, and that's a problem. It is going to come out of the Congress. but the reduction of the corporate tax rate to 15%, I can tell you, is not, in my view, feasible. If we could get it in the mid-20s range, it would be much more likely to happen, but I do think it's important. Another thing that I think is important, and you asked specifically about this district, I'm going to keep fighting to end the New York Medicaid mandate on the local property taxpayers. If you add up what the taxpayers, the property taxpayers, pay in the 57 counties outside of New York City, if you add that up, it's about $2.3 billion. That amount is more than the local taxpayers pay for Medicaid costs in the 49 other states combined. This was the single worst thing that Nelson Rockefeller did as governor, imposing this burden on local homeowners, local business property taxpayers. It is driving jobs and businesses out of our state. And I can tell you, again, as I said before, the two things that people say the most about our state is that their kids and grandchildren can't find jobs here, and their property taxes are too high, and when they retire, they're getting the heck out of here. This is something, this Medicaid mandate, many people have just become inured to it. And you know, some of the opponents that the governor rousted about said, oh, well, this will mean you're going to cut Medicaid services for people. Well, here's what the General Accounting Office, the Comptroller General of the United States, an Obama appointee, who, by the way, is a really good guy. We had him in the Budget Committee. And he told us 15% of Medicaid payments are inappropriate, either fraudulent or mistakenly made. 15%. In New York State, that's $9 billion. $9 billion. My proposal would end the $2.3 billion that is imposed on the county property taxes. That's $40 million that comes out of the property taxpayers in Ulster County. It's almost half of what the county legislature and the county executive have to raise in real estate taxes from people who live in Ulster County. In Otsego County, Cooperstown, where you grew up, 91% of the tax burden goes to pay for mandated Medicaid costs. It's an outrage, and it does not make any sense that we put this burden on homeowners. This is what's killing New York. It's what's killing upstate New York. We are losing population. Every single county in this district has lost population in the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 20 years. We are being depopulated in upstate New York because the burden on businesses, the burden on homeowners, the burden on jobs is too much. People are fleeing, voting with their feet. What more evidence do we need that we've got to fix this? So those are the things that I stand for. Those are the things that I believe. And you know, when I ran, it's a quaint topic. I read the Medicaid law. And the Medicaid law says the state can impose this burden on localities, but only Rockefeller, and for the last 51 years, only Albany has done it the way Albany did it. Think of it, folks. We pay more in local property taxes to support state Medicaid costs than the 49 other states combined local taxpayers. It's crazy, it's obscene, and I'm going to keep fighting to change it.
So legislating state issues from Washington and having it only be focused on New York is not your job.
Exactly. Oh, I would say it is my job. In fact, I'm working on other things right now. We have a thing called the scaffold law in New York State. This raises the costs of every single family home in New York State by approximately $10,000. It means it's strict liability if there's an injury on a construction site, if there's a gravity-related thing. You hear the trial lawyers on TV saying, construction accident? Call us, because you know why? They don't have to prove a thing in their case. Someone could go up on a ladder drunk, and the owner of the property and the contractor are strictly liable in tort. We are the only state in the country to do it. So you know what I'm proposing in September? I'm proposing, and this is news. I haven't announced this yet. I'm proposing that any federal dollars, if they're federal dollars that are used for transportation, for bridges, for community development, for FEMA projects, for housing, affordable housing projects, are increased by 7 to 10% more in our state because of this crazy law that no other state in the nation has. So rather than waste federal taxpayer resources and waste resources and continue to drive people out of our state, making it more unaffordable, I'm going to propose that if we have a situation where you're using federal dollars in our state for construction, you have comparable negligence rather than strict liability. That will save everyone money. And that's what I'm about. That's why we've got to change what's happening. People are voting with their feet. They're getting the heck out of here. That's what's happening. Why is our district 11 counties from Vermont to Pennsylvania? Because 30 years ago, this district, 30, no, this district, no, you are utterly uninformed in that regard. These district lines were done, these district lines were done by a federal magistrate judge. There was no politics involved in that whatsoever. But 30 years ago, this district, the size of this district in upstate New York, would have 2 members of Congress. We are literally depopulating ourselves because of these crazy policies, and that is what I'm going to try to change. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here
Again, thank you for everybody. We really wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to ask questions tonight. I hope that you feel that you had that opportunity.